Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Becky, I'm the CEO of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to see you this afternoon. Just a quick word about the EA. We are a learning society and subject association, which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and defend the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through secondary and further education to higher education and beyond. We cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this afternoon's are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you so much to you for joining us, and to Arlene for chairing our conversation this evening. Our members also make it possible for us to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute and help support the discipline, please do consider joining us as a member. It costs just over £50 for a whole year to support our events and campaigning work, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Right, that's it from me. I'm out. I will hand over to you, Arlene, and our fantastic speakers. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Becky. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Arlene Holmes-Henderson, and I'm Professor of Classics Education and Public Policy at Durham University. I feel a little bit of an infiltrator at this event because I don't work in English studies, but my co-editor of the special issue of the spring newsletter focused on Oracy is Dr. Tom Wright, who is in English studies at the University of Sussex, and so he has been holding my hand as I set foot into the world of English, both in secondary schools and in universities. Tom is unfortunately not able to join us this evening owing to a family emergency. But he will be absolutely thrilled to see that so many of you have chosen to be with us to talk about the newsletter in which so many contributors from different areas of the English ecosystem contributed their ideas and perspectives on the topic of oracy. It's important to say that was one of 3 special issues that Tom and I co-edited. We also co-edited a special issue of The Use of English, a journal aimed largely at secondary teachers. And we also co-edited a special issue of the English Journal, the Journal of the English Association. So if you liked what you read in the spring newsletter, the great news is that there are 2 more special issues allocated to Oracy, which you can also have a look at. Without further ado, I'm going to ask the contributors who are joining us this evening from that spring newsletter to introduce themselves and to jog your memories about what their article was about. Let's start with Tracy.
Okay, hello. My name's Tracy Irish. My article was about oracy in the deaf classroom. And that came about because I've been working on a project that we call Signing Shakespeare, which is essentially about translating Shakespeare into BSL, British Sign Language, and creating resources and schemes of work for young people who are deaf and hard of hearing to be able to access Shakespeare as a compulsory element of the curriculum. And the article really gave a little bit of background about deaf education, Shakespeare's place in deaf education, and a little bit of context about the project, which is using theatre-based practice. So my field is working with theatre and education. I do a lot of work, research and practice with the Royal Shakespeare Company and also with the University of Birmingham. And this project started as a collaboration between the 2 of them. And as part of that collaboration, we created a scheme of work for the whole of Macbeth, aimed at kind of Key Stage 3, but well, really Key Stage 3, but we're sort of wondering how it goes into a bit of Key Stage 2 and a bit of Key Stage 4. But we're exploring all of that. So we've created a lot of resources around that, working with deaf artists, deaf actors, deaf filmmakers, because we've produced films that are actors performing little clips of Shakespeare from Macbeth in BSL. And also when I was working on that, we'd started just doing The Tempest. So we've just created this beautiful, if I say it myself, completely beautiful performance of The Tempest with Braidwood Trust School for the Deaf, with students from that school who are using a total communication approach, using sign language and speech and mime and gesture and subtitles and all sorts of things in order to convey the story to the audience. So that's probably enough to start with.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tracy. Next on my screen is Jeff.
Hello, afternoon, everyone. Jeff Barton. I've had various incarnations, but essentially I'm a kind of grizzled English teacher of many years ago. So this is in my bloodstream, this kind of stuff. I'm currently chairing an independent commission on Oracy that was set up back in April. It was sponsored by Voice 21, many of you will know, as a charity which is there to promote Oracy, but it's independent of Voice 21, although they're sponsoring it. And we put together a panel of people, some of whom are deeply rooted in education, some of whom aren't. So you've got people there who represent employers, you've got the artistic director of the National Theatre, you've got professor of sociolinguistics, etc. And we've got an expert panel as well, which has been helping us to think through three questions. What is Oracy? If we're going to really make it cut through, 50 years after the Bullock report was talking about the importance of spoken communication, that's 50 years ago. If we're really going to make it cut through into a new government with a new curriculum and assessment review, let's make sure we've got a real sense of what Oracy is. Why does it particularly matter now, in a time when everyone's got an opinion about everything, everyone shouts about everything? How can we help prepare young people for a world in which actually listening is particularly important, and the ability to be able to argue agreeably becomes ever more important? So that's our second thing. And the third thing is, can we propose a small number of significant changes which would help children and young people, would help the teaching profession, would put some joy back into the classroom, and would be good for our democracy? That's what we've been working on. 3 weeks from now, we will be launching our report. We'll be talking about it at the Labour conference next week. More than happy to give you a flavour of some of the insights coming through from that. But the reason I'm here is because I'm chairing that independent commission on Oracy in education.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jeff. And I saw nodding on the screen when you said, putting some joy back into the English classroom. Yes, bring back the joy. Let's move on now to Lynn.
Hi there, I'm Lynn Gorham. I started life as an English teacher. I'm now a teacher educator based in Norwich. When I wrote this article, I was an English subject development lead working in a team at Teach First, focusing on developing English trainees' pedagogical content knowledge and talking with them about their teaching and their teaching development. I'm now a skip director for my sins, but I have a special interest in making sure that I keep hold of my English skills and knowledge, and particularly when it comes to creative writing. I'm also lucky enough to live really close to the National Centre for Writing, and I go to a teachers' writing group that's run at the National Centre for Writing, and I feel like I have learned a huge amount from that itself. So creative writing is sort of my passion, although I wouldn't claim to have any talent at the actual output. I would say that writing, talking about writing and teaching writing is something that I feel is so incredibly important. And so for that reason, my article was about how important it is that talk is part of the process when it comes to writing. Now, actually, that could be in processing reading so that we can think about how we've understood the text that we've read, and think about our own sort of constructing meaning, understanding, processing, perhaps opinion forming, negotiating and discussing with other people. Or it could be in talking to explore ideas before we do any kind of writing, creative writing or writing about reading. I've looked both at the sort of growth model, so thinking about how talk can help us develop an identity as a writer, and also an example identified as writing showing sensitivity to human emotion. Now that's great for exams assess, but it's also vital for our own personal development and also for developing that confidence and identity as a writer, which I think goes obviously all the way through life. And how, without talk and without time to talk, we really cannot produce an authentic piece of writing.
Fantastic, thank you. And finally, Emily.
Hi, so I am a secondary school teacher, and I wrote my article based on my journey of completing an MSc in learning and teaching at the University of Oxford. And I I worked for 2 years, years 7 through 13, on trying to get teenagers to talk productively in class. And I kind of explained how that journey started off a little rough. You can't just walk in your first lesson and say, we're doing Oracy today. And, 30 teenagers would just love and relish that moment. It does take time. You do need to think carefully about what your goals are. It does take scaffolding, at least at the beginning. Students need time to build confidence in what they're doing. And then once they have that confidence, then they can kind of go off on their own and discuss and ask questions and start to build. But you have to have those foundations in your class before you kind of just let students go off and discuss what it is that you're doing in a lesson. So my article was about the practical skills that I needed to implement in order to get to that point.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to ask the panel just one question, and then the rest of the time is going to be available for attendees to ask the panel whatever questions you might like. So already I'm sure you've got some questions for individuals, but my question that's open to all is, what Oracy innovation would you like to see? And this innovation might be an innovation in policy around Oracy, it might be an innovation in research around Oracy, or it might be an innovation around practice. But let's start with Jeff, because you've had a bit of a head start here in terms of thinking about recommendations. So which innovation would you most like to see?
Yeah, so when we set up this commission on Oracy, we were in a different world. We're all in a different world, because what we thought we would be doing is spending 4 meetings, 4 months, and then proposing to whoever might be putting their manifesto in place, ready to come into government, making recommendations to get into the manifesto. Well, the ground has shifted there, hasn't it? Because you've now got a government in place where, although they've kind of flirted with the word Oracy, and they sometimes call it spoken skills and sometimes spoken communication and sometimes speaking and listening, they're now saying as one of their pillars of achievement, Oracy is fundamental. That's a very significant change to where we started. That's a big win. So what would we be saying in practice? And I think that in answer to your question there, Arlene, what we would be saying is there are probably 3 bits to this, right? The stuff you need to do for children and young people. We know from all of the evidence, from loads of people, some of whom are on this call, but people like Robin Alexander as well, that actually helping children learn to talk and to listen, learning through talk and listening, and learning about talk has never been more important. So the stuff about the curriculum review, which the government has launched, it's got a year, we will want to influence that curriculum review to say, could you make Oracy more fundamental to that? It shows up in the current curriculum, actually, but it shows up in a place that nobody notices it. It shows up in the aims of the curriculum rather than in the granular bits of it. So the stuff around children and young people having an entitlement from whatever their background is to Oracy. The second bit goes back to my point about joy in the classroom. Because the reality is that for too many teachers and too many young people, we've got this kind of cookie cutter model that if only you did things like this, if only you use these knowledge planners, if only you taught vocabulary in this kind of way, everything will be well. The reality is that great use of Oracy by teachers as part of their repertoire is fundamental and gives back agency to the teaching profession. And at a time when we're losing so many teachers, we lost 44,000 teachers from the profession last year, and we haven't replaced them. We have to do something so that teachers are reminded they have extraordinary professional skills, and that ability to be able to harness Oracy is absolutely fundamental. And my third point would simply be that one of the things we will be recommending is around democracy and how we argue about stuff. And there will be schools that are doing that in extraordinary ways within the classroom, in PSHE lessons, in citizenship, and around the classroom in the thing I used to run as head of a comprehensive school here, the Debating Society, where we were helping young people to take on a range of different topics, and they were learning how to talk, how to listen, how to win arguments. As Arlene said in the introduction, that's never been more important, particularly if, as the government has hinted at, they're going to give 16-year-olds the right to vote. So whether it's what are we recommending in terms of children and young people, what are we recommending in terms of giving agency back to the teaching profession, what are we recommending to help secure a kind of pretentiousness, a sense of why democracy matters for the future generation, that seems to me the reason that Oracy has never been more important.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeff. Who would like to go next? Lynn.
I'm happy to go next. So mine is not quite as transformative as Jeff's. Perhaps, I don't know. I haven't been teaching for a while, and I haven't been in an English classroom for a while. But I suppose I would say that as an English teacher, it always can, or it can feel a bit frustrating to always feel like you're the person that's responsible for oracy. And actually, seeing any talk in any classroom, any kind of talk in any sort of context as oracy, so that we're thinking about reading aloud. A lot of teachers would say they're really confident in managing reading aloud, but actually that often means the logistical parts of when to start, when to stop, and who's talking. Actually, there's a huge amount more to it than that, even if you're reading for for information rather than for something a bit more aesthetic. But also that oracy isn't about perfect speaking or presentation, but it's tentative and exploratory, and actually those kinds of turns in discussions between students are hugely valuable. I'm not sure students, certainly lots of the students that I used to teach, I'm not sure I really made it that clear to them, or that they felt confident that the things they were saying were really valuable. And so for me, my innovation would perhaps be to go back into the classroom and to think about talking about talk more, so that we could understand what was happening while we were doing it, and try to look at that and from a whole school perspective.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Who's next? Emily.
I think what I'd really like to see is an emphasis on prioritizing practice when it comes to oracy. I think quite often the reason that we don't take time to get started and embed these skills in our classes is because we're so overwhelmed with all the content that we feel we need to get through on a regular basis. Whereas if this became important, not just in English, but in a variety of different subjects, and we took the time as schools and practitioners to teach that listening is a variety of skills, speaking is actually a variety of skills. And if we can embed those skills, the content can then be the vessel through which we practice those skills. And what I noticed through my work is we can get through more content later once we have those initial skills set first. So once we realize the power of what oracy and dialogue in the classroom can create, I think it'd be create more of an emphasis on teachers to find that time. But if that came through policy, this is something that we need to be checking to ensure that we have in classrooms. It might add that little bit of incentive to say, all right, it is worth beginning of each unit, let's recap these skills, or beginning of the school year, this is what we're going to work on first. Focusing on the skills base and how those skills can then be embedded in the curriculum throughout all subjects. I would love to see that as a main focus.
Fantastic. And I love how your answer bridges both policy and practice. And Tracy, what innovation around oracy would you love to see?
Well, I was nodding a lot to what Emily was saying there, because I think it is about that skills base. And for me, what I have found fascinating about this project, my background is an English and drama teacher. So, oracy, I think, is absolutely crucial in the English classroom, but also as a cross-curricular skill. But this project, working with deaf students, deaf teachers of the deaf artists, deaf actors, why that has been fascinating for me is because is all those other aspects of oracy that aren't just speaking aloud words. So it's those, fancy word of paralinguistic skills about our facial expressions, our body language, if we are speaking, our tone of voice, but also crucially the context of how we speak words, the context of who we're speaking them to, when we're speaking them, how we're speaking them. So all of that aspect around oracy that isn't just to do with the words that come out of our mouths, I would love to see kind of more focus on, and I think we can learn a lot from the deaf community around that. And just that term oracy, because as we know, oracy is a word that we're very used to in education circles. It's quite an alien word to a lot of people outside. And when I say the word oracy to people in the deaf community, they kind of bristle, understandably, because for them, there is that connection to oralism, which historically in teaching of the deaf has been this emphasis on speaking, getting deaf people to speak, rather than encouraging them to sign and kind of actively discouraging sign. So there is that aspect. And I know there's been a lot of talk about what term do we use? What term can we use? And I think for me, coming from this perspective of there's something about talk that works, because talk is inclusive. Talk is about all of us. Talk is about that context of having a conversation, learning through dialogue, building those skills, whereas speech can be a bit more one way. And I don't think there's an easy answer to what do we call this term. I quite like Oracy, but I think for me, there's got to be those qualifications around it. So more emphasis on that, what do we mean, but the wider aspects of how we communicate with each other that isn't through writing.
Arlene, do you mind if I just respond to that? Because I think that's an incredibly important point, and some of the people we've been talking about are absolutely rooted in precisely what you say there. We want a curriculum and an education system that is utterly inclusive, that makes you feel that you are part of it. And at the moment, we know, I mean, you all know as well as I do, all of you, that a fifth of young people aren't coming to school at the moment. So there is something going wrong in our education system at the moment, right? And that's partly about curriculum. It might be about teaching. It might be about social mores having changed, as it were. So we've had a big debate as a commission about, is the word oracy the right word? It's an ugly word. It would seem bizarre to us that we say, let's stop talking about oracy, given we're an oracy commission. But you're absolutely right to say, how do we make it punch through to a wider audience? And we've had some submissions to us that say, if oracy is as important as we're all saying, then you need to signal that by it being formally assessed. So, should all children at the age of 11 have to do some kind of speaking and listening test? Should that count to how the school's performance tables are going? Should you at 16 have to do that as well? There are arguments as to, well, you do that in reading, you do it in writing, you do it in math. So why would you not do it if we think oracy is important? My background isn't just as an English teacher. I used to run a trade union where we used to argue against this ugly stuff, accountability, putting it into Ofsted, putting it into performance tables. But the debate is still a live one. And there are still people who email me saying, if you think oracy matters, then you need to train Ofsted inspectors so that when they come into a school and oracy is happening, whatever that means, that they are able to measure it. For me, that's the last thing we want to do. We want to do this because it's important for children and young people, because they learn their subjects, they tell the stories of those subjects, they tell the story of who they are, and it's important for teachers. But the last thing you want to do is to mandate that either through assessment or accountability. And I think that's the heart of the debate, which the Commission is at the moment having before we do our final report in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Fantastic. So I'm encouraging attendees to think about their questions they might have for the panel, and you can either put these in the chat or you can put your hands up and ask a question. Bonus response from the chair here. The innovation I would love to see is return to the teaching of rhetoric. And that's because rhetoric, I think, links oracy and citizenship. And if we want young people to be able to go out beyond school and be active and participatory citizens in society who can form arguments, but who can also recognise bad arguments, spot fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and who can protest powerfully, who can negotiate, and who can engage with audiences and understand how to get their messages across in a compelling way, then rhetoric has stood the test of time. It's been around for more than 2,000 years. If it ain't broke, why fix it? I think more schools should be teaching classical rhetoric. So enough from the panel. It's time now to move on to your questions. We've got great questions in the chat. Thank you so much, everybody, for putting them there. Let's start with Claire Hadfield's question. What are people's thoughts about relinking speaking and listening, or oracy, to English GCSE? Yes or no? How else to raise the stakes and value of oracy?
It's challenging to say raising stakes because, I mean, the stakes are already there. Really, when we talk about do we use oracy, do we use speaking, listening, what words do we use? It comes down to the concept of communication. Do our students know how to communicate and how to receive communication? And if they don't know that, how can they really be learning in any of our subjects? how do we really know what it is they're taking in, aside from, can you regurgitate something that you've heard in a lesson and write it down on paper? There's so much more to life. I mean, there's a reason that schools have a variety of different subjects that we're trying to cover. It's because there's so much our students need to take into the world with them. So I think the stakes are already quite there. Aside from, what Jeff was really arguing against, yeah, it shouldn't really be through Ofsted, but I think through education of not only students, but also our teachers on how vital these skills are and really what's being lost by not having them. If we can get that across, then the stakes will become, the most important thing we teach in our lessons is this element of communication.
Does anyone else want to come in answering that one?
I'm conscious I will feel like I'm hogging it, but I will just say something particularly on this, if that's okay, because we've had lots of organisations representing English community talking about the fact that particularly English GCSE language is not fit for purpose. You would kind of hope that the GCSE English language would teach young people about the English language. It largely doesn't do that. And therefore, one of the things I think we will be strongly recommending is, could we have an English language qualification that actually teaches young people about the history of their language, the diversity of language, the way language and power work, all of that kind of stuff that we would say is really important. We think that's a good thing. But part of the washback of that is that a lot of English teachers in secondary come from a background of having studied English literature. Great. But it means that they're not always particularly confident about English language. So part of the washback would be that actually, if your children are going to be assessed in terms of their understanding of English language, it becomes more important. But here's the point. Those people we have spoken to from the English language community, the English teachers, have generally said, if you're going to have a national curriculum that talks about the importance of reading, writing, speaking and listening, it would be perverse that speaking and listening is not being formally assessed. There are all kinds of problems with that, workload problems, methodological problems, etc. But it does seem to me, if we think Oracy is important, then somewhere in the curriculum, it needs to show up and be formally assessed so that young people can say, okay, so I might not be as good at reading or at writing, but look at how I'm doing in my ability to speak, my ability to listen. And Tim Oates, the architect of the national curriculum, reminded us that in the Netherlands, for example, they have introduced an assessment, a formal assessment in listening skills, because they think that the ability to listen is so important that actually the way you make it happen is through having it as part of the assessment. I don't know that we're going to be saying that, but nevertheless, it is a live debate, I think that.
Excellent, thank you. And I think listening is often underrated, and a lot of the conversation is about speaking. But I noticed that Voice 21 has as the theme for Oracy October listening. So that's maybe going to bring a renewed focus on the listening part of Oracy. And I'm looking forward to seeing what resources might be developed out of that project. Okay, I'm going to take one more question from the chat and then we'll come to questions from people with hands up. So Stephanie Hilder's question: if the teaching day were a pie, what fraction of the pie would you allocate to Oracy in all its forms? I love this metaphor.
I'll say something on that. I think as a secondary school teacher, I guess I might start with, it might depend on the subject, and within each subject it might depend on the topic. Because English lends itself really well, obviously, to discussing, negotiating, forming ideas. I don't think it's necessarily quite the same when it comes to things like individual practice. But I might also say that I think I might find it hard to make it into some kind of pie, because actually for me Oracy runs through everything, and therefore I think it would be difficult to sort of cut it out and quantify it for me, certainly, because it's something that we might plan to do. It's something that I might do at the spur of the moment. It might be something that I might do as a sort of responsive thing. It might be something that I would do because I wanted to give students an opportunity to have a little bit more thinking time. I might want them to talk, but as Emily was saying, having that structure to talk is so important. If I find that my students are struggling to find the words, then I might get them to do some free writing before they talk. And so I think I would be extremely flexible with my pie if I were to have it.
Tracy.
I'm just going to agree, really, in terms of I think there's a tension between a lot of what we've said in terms of it is this it's this thing that we can't quite pin down, isn't it, Oracy? It's the speaking and listening skills that we all develop because we develop them from babies onwards, as very young children. A lot of it we take for granted, and a lot of it we know is to do with socioeconomic background. Another thing, just to bring in, I have written an article about deaf education. So another thing that's really interesting about deaf young people is that 90% of them are born to hearing parents. So while deafness in itself isn't a learning disability, deaf children born to deaf parents will probably have BSL as their first language, absolutely fine in terms of their language development. But for the vast majority of deaf students, they are born, or deaf children, they are born to hearing parents who probably have no idea what to do and how to communicate with their own children. So that's where those kind of language development issues start to come in for them. And of course, that's true. That's not just about deaf young people. We know that early access to language is so important for everybody across the board. So I think it's that tension between something that we take for granted, because those of us who learn to be fairly proficient in Oracy, we absorb it from things around us. Whereas for a lot of people, those skills need to be taught. They need to be encouraged. So it is that how do we reconcile that tension between something that is the primary skill of how we all learn and communicate, because that's what we've evolved to do. We've all been speaking and listening for an awful lot longer than we've been writing. How do we use that? How do we kind of use that those primary skills? But yeah, how do we assess them so that we can kind of go, yes, we've done that and we have developed skills? How do we know we're developing those skills? It is a real tension. But in answer to the question, I think I absolutely agree with Lynn. It's really tricky to go, right, well, we're going to give 10 minutes to Oracy in this lesson, because it really should, I think, just infuse everything.
I think that's a really important point. There were people who, when we set this commission up, were emailing me saying, do you remember how we used to have the literacy hour and the numeracy hour? We need to have an Oracy hour. Frankly, that's the last thing we need to do. This should infuse everything. One of the most interesting bits of chairing this commission has been putting together a series of podcasts of talking to different people, like Arlene, for example, and others on the call here. And the one that had the biggest effect on me was David Thomas, who works for an organization called Axiom Maths. And he says the most fundamental skill you need in maths is the ability to articulate how you have solved a problem, to explain why you think this is the answer to it. And he says, when you look at places like Russia, for example, Japan, Finland, the ability to be able to articulate what you have done and to explain it takes you a million miles away from the way too many of us conceive about maths, which is right and wrong answers. He says not about right and wrong answers. The podcast is on our list of podcasts and really interesting. And that's why I think the question which Stephanie puts here, which is about essentially, when we had Oracy assessment in the past, did it make young people better at it? Tim Oates, again, architect of the national curriculum, he says you can introduce a formal assessment in Oracy if you want to, but don't delude yourself it'll make Oracy teaching better. It'll probably make it worse, because people will teach to the test rather than building it in as a series of episodes within their teacher. If we want children to argue the pros and cons of climate change, you want them to do that with knowledgeable teachers in geography and science who also understand that Oracy is part of their repertoire to help liberate young children to be able to talk about all of this stuff. Now, that's a big ask, I think, but we've got a government which is doing two things. One is they're reviewing the curriculum, and the second thing is they're reviewing the way we develop our teachers with a commitment to teacher development. This is our opportunity, I think, to do things because they really matter to young people and teachers, not because they're easily measurable, even though that would be a simpler solution in a way. Sorry, Arlene, I'm going to shut up in a minute.
No, that's great. And both you and Tracy have picked up on another comment that's in the chat from Rupert Knight, which says we have to remember that Oracy is a skill which is in all curriculum subjects. This should be in all lessons, not just the responsibility of English teachers or the English subject community, but we need to be thinking about all teachers of all subjects across the curriculum feeling competent and confident to ensure that Oracy is a cross-curricular skill. let's go to Tara, who's been waiting very patiently to ask her question.
Yeah, I just thought it'd be social. Thanks for that. My question is around subject specificity, which was just touched on. So we know from a recent School of Economics from the University of Bristol, from a study from them, that that actually students that do better than average in GCSE maths have higher than average time to do independent practice, whereas in English, it's higher than average peer-to-peer talk time. And I don't know if you guys are all old enough as to remember, like I do, that prior to 2014, we had a discussion assessment in English, where, so I'm going to argue with Tim Oates here and say, actually, the skills that we built in to teach discussion skills in English, particularly collaboration, building on ideas, interrogating assumptions, was an absolute godsend, you know, for teaching pupils who were lower attaining, who normally weren't that engaged, to actually build those skills in. And those were peer-to-peer skills that had a dramatic effect on their attainment later on. So I just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on actually building in subject-specific Oracy, such as in English, peer-to-peer talk skills? And is it possible to build in assessments in a way where there would be a positive washback effect?
I read that article last year, Tara, I think, about independent practice in maths and talking English. There must be a tipping point, I think, mustn't there? But as a teacher educator, I would say, and I've just written it in the chat to somebody, what I would love to see is a lot more discussion around an instruction of Oracy approaches in on QTS and PGCE courses, so that we've got trainee teachers who are getting these kind of pedagogical approaches embedded into the way that they practice their subject, so that they can confidently go into classrooms and work with Oracy in whatever form, you know, that looks like in terms of success. But I think often it's that confidence, isn't it, that you know, that we oh, I tried group work and it didn't really work, so we're not going to do it anymore. And Emily's been talking about, you know, we absolutely have to have structures for modeling how to talk, modeling how to have those kinds of conversations, because if we don't model those kind of conversations, it's a bit like, as a writer, you know, one of the things I talk about a lot is and I write about a lot, is that we often don't practice writing, and we feel really unconfident about our own writing as teachers of writing, but that we absolutely must, otherwise we are not practicing the kinds of things we're expecting our students to do. And I think it's the same with Oracy, and therefore having that, you know, the teacher education opportunity to think about what Oracy looks like in the subject, to practice it so that they can explicitly model it to their students and scaffold how we might talk to each other, is absolutely vital.
I think another way, not necessarily around it, but included with this, is not necessarily testing Oracy skills in themselves, but also including that as the way that we test. You know, there's been a lot of research around lately about authentic assessment, and, you know, how often once students leave, say, the English class, are they going to sit down for hours on end and write essays? Whereas how important is it to be able to verbally communicate that they have read and have understood something? Whereas if we could, you know, verbally assess students, you know, their verbal essay instead of their written essay, how well do you know that text? Can you explain it to me? You're still pulling out evidence from the text. You're still defending yourself. We're probably doing it with a little bit more passion orally than you are if you're trying to write by pen, and maybe your hand's a little out of practice because you're so used to using your computer. But your verbal skills, your communication skills are so vital when you leave the classroom that maybe that's something that should just be part of how we do our assessment and what we do in class.
Yeah, and just to add one quick point to that, because I've had the very interesting experience over the last year of going back into an English classroom, having been out of the classroom as a teacher for about 15 years. I've been involved with a lot of teacher training. I do a lot of work with teachers about how to teach Shakespeare, but I haven't actually taught English as a subject with a proper class for probably more than 15 years. And I had the opportunity to do that last year. I had 2 Key Stage 3 classes in my local school. They let me in. But it was so fascinating in so many ways. But coming from this, Oracy is really important, theatre-based practice, this is how we do things. The main kind of, there were lots of restrictions I found in terms of how English is now taught, in terms of what people think the curriculum needs to be. But the main obstacle I found was space, to be honest. The tiny kind of English classroom I had, where you couldn't move desks, teachers were sat in rows, I was sharing the class, I couldn't take control of that. So I had to go into an English classroom with students sat in rows, and try and work out ways to productively do Oracy with quite a few. And the students said this to me, we find this really hard because a lot of them had autism were on the autistic spectrum in various ways, just couldn't process the noise that was going on in that tiny space. So I think there's a lot of issues also around, yes, there are lots of skills that we build up, but we need the space. And I was thinking this, Emily, with your article about time, and absolutely, you know, this is the thing about theatre-based practice as well. It takes time to really build up, but then it's just so pays off dividends. And the time investment is important, but you need space to be able to move students around as well. And I think that's another kind of really practical thing about being in an English classroom that really hit me.
Fantastic. Okay, this is going to be the last question, and I'm going to ask panelists to speak for no more than 30 seconds each so that we can finish on time. I'm taking the most popular question from the chat this time. So it's the one that's got the most likes. Hannah Appleton says, confidence with Oracy starts with modelling. How can we arm all staff with skills to deliver? Coaching? CPD?
I think in order to learn how to talk, learn how to teach talking, you absolutely have to talk. And so I think opportunities to discuss with each other, to construct activities, to try them out, reflect on them, to watch each other teach, all of those things, to talk about how we're talking. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the notion of disciplinary oracy. So if I'm a secondary teacher and I'm teaching geography, for example, what are the kind of skills I need, and what do I need to be listening out for my youngsters, and how do I make a judgment about that? That needs much more emphasis in teacher training. But at the moment, teacher training and early development kind of finishes after the second year for too many teachers. We have got now a commitment to ongoing training, and it seems to me that we all develop our skills by getting feedback and practicing that, including how we use low-key assessment of young people rather than high-stakes assessment. All of that should be part of a teacher's armoury, I think, as they move through the profession.
Thanks, Jeff.
I just say very quickly, I think it is about practice. I think a lot of CPD in schools is about policies and theories, and actually you need the practice alongside that for teachers to have a go themselves and be in the position of the student to understand how it feels for them as well.
I agree. CPD works if it is consistent and over time. I think if we did whole school CPD that explained its importance, the benefits of Oracy, get some buy-in, but also time within departments. What does that look like in your department with people who are trying to do the same thing, practicing with each other, being able to reflect, come back, discussing that, both at the department level and whole school level? The more that a school emphasizes anything's importance, the more likely you're going to have more and more teachers buy in and practice and do in their own classrooms. So if we're making sure that this is a school priority and they work on at least 4 or 5, maybe 6 sessions throughout a school year, it's going to show its importance, especially if reflection is a core element of that practice.
Wonderful. And I would say another piece of the jigsaw is critical reflection on professional practice and the support to interrogate that professional practice. Tom and I run a free action research programme on Oracy in partnership with the English Speaking Union, where up to 25 teachers from state-maintained schools across the country can be supported on a year-long programme every year. The next cohort will be opening in October this year, starting in January, and teachers are then supported to look at Oracy. It might be just in their classroom, it might be in their subject across the school, it might be across the whole school, or indeed across a multi-academy trust. But having support to use the current evidence base on Oracy, but think critically about how it applies specifically to practice, is an important element of supporting teachers to feel confident and competent in the delivery of Oracy in their classrooms. So I'm going to stop there and pass back to Becky, who I'm sure has final words for us.
Thank you. Well, they are just final words of gratitude. So thank you so much to Tracy and Emily and Lynn and Jeff. That's been an incredible conversation. Thank you to everyone who's participated and asked brilliant questions. You've really made the discussion keep charging forward. And thank you to Arlene for keeping us organised, on time, on topic, a masterclass in chairing. So thank you so much. And I hope to see all of you at another one of our events soon. Thank you and have a good evening.